Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Power After Carbon, Findings and Insights for State Policymakers. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, as part of the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. We'll tell you a bit more about all of this in just a minute, but before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone or you can connect via computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled there on your screen. You can also click on that to expand your webinar console. And one of the things that you might like to do on your webinar console is to type in a question or a comment. We encourage you to do that. We want to hear from you. We'll be saving some time at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience. So please do type in your questions and your comments as you think of them. Don't wait until the very end to type them in. And a final note for you, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the webinar slides within about 24 to 48 hours, likely this afternoon. And we'll also be posting the webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'll pass it over now to our host for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to get us started today. Warren?
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. So let me tell you about the Clean Energy States Alliance. We're a national membership organization composed of public agencies. And if you see the screen, which shows the logos of our members, you can see that most of our members are state agencies of one sort or another. And we do a lot of information exchange among them, group projects, we have working groups, and a range of activities. And one of our recent activities, which includes more than just our members, is the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. This is an effort that allows states that have adopted 100% clean energy goals for the electricity sector to share their experiences, learn from each other, figure out which issues they have to overcome in order to make sure they reach their end target of 100% clean electricity. And if we could go to the next slide. And one of the things we've been doing through the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative is bringing to the states and to anyone else who's interested, leading figures who've been presenting ideas that impinge on this topic of how do you get to 100% clean energy. And today we're really fortunate to have with us Peter Fox-Penner to talk about his new book. And Peter Fox-Penner has had a career that includes leadership in academia, government, and the private sector. He's founder and director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. He's also a professor of practice at the Questrom School of Business at BU, where he teaches courses on sustainable energy and electric power. Prior to BU, he served for over 2 decades as principal and chairman of the Brattle Group, which is an economic consulting firm where he's still an academic advisor. Before that, he was at the U.S. Department of Energy and at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Among his many publications is the influential 2010 book, Smart Power, Climate Change, the Smart Grid, and the Future of Electric Utilities. And the book he's going to talk about today is a sequel to Smart Power, and it has a lot of information that's relevant to policymakers and state program planners who are thinking about how to move from where we are today to an electricity system that's 100% clean. And so let me turn it over to you, Peter, and I'll be back when it's time for questions.
Thanks, Warren, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. I love the opportunity to talk to CISA, and I really salute what you guys are doing. I think it is really important, truly, I mean that. And also, since Warren showed the logo chart, I didn't realize fully who was involved in CISA. So many friends on that chart. Of course, my institute at BU, the Institute for Sustainable Energies in Massachusetts, and we work with Mass DOE, the CEC and DEP. And I want to give a shout out to them, along with many friends at NREL and NYSERDA at the CEC. And a special heartfelt hello to my Rhode Island colleagues, because I am speaking to you from my house in Little Compton, Rhode Island right now. So it's really fun to be here. It's also a little embarrassing because this book is a sequel to Smart Power, which Warren was kind enough to mention. It's a little deeper dive, but in 30 or 35 minutes, which is what I'm going to try and keep it to, I can really only skim the surface. And in doing that, I'm afraid I'm going to not break much new ground. I think many of you are going to know almost everything that's said here, and I apologize for that now. The advantage of the book, I hope, is that it, first of all, it collects it all in one place. And second of all, in the book itself, there's deeper discussions of these and other issues. But we just can't get into them. And I'll give you an example of that when we get to the power market debate slide, which we could easily spend 40 minutes talking about, or if not 40 days. But with that, with all those caveats, let's dive in. See if I can get this to advance. There we go. There's three parts to this talk. The first part, and to the book. The first part is electricity's role in climate solutions. The second part is about what I call the big grid, what we in the industry call the wholesale or bulk power grid. And the third part is about the distribution utility portion of the industry, which is downstream for short. Let's go. Let's dive in. The book was really motivated by lots of changes in the industry and certainly the rising importance of the climate crisis. I'm going to spare a long discussion of this. I'm sure all of you are aware of the dire need to cope with climate change and the fact that we're not on track as a country or as a planet. We're more on track to 3.5 to 4 degrees. And there's all sorts of toxic effects of this, including the wildfires burning right now across California. So many of you probably also know where greenhouse gases come from. This is important to our discussion. In the United States, electricity is 27% of greenhouse gases now, but that is the one sector here that is going down steadily year after year. It's already come down 29% since 2005. And with your help and your leadership, we will get it to zero. But transportation, you see, is now in the United States and also Europe, the largest sectoral source of greenhouse gases. Agriculture is 10%. Many estimates make it more than that. It's the hardest to measure. And then commercial and residential heating and other energy use in industrial energy use, 22%. That beach ball, those sources of emissions inform a pretty strong consensus in the developed world about the decarbonization or climate change strategy for energy. Agriculture is special, it's different, it's very important. But if you talk about the rest of that beach ball, it's predominantly energy-related greenhouse gases that are the problem. And the overall solution, as many of you know, not a lot of news here, is first of all, accelerate and maximize energy efficiency, because the cleanest BTU or kilowatt hour you will ever use is the one you don't use. We need to electrify quite a bit of transportation, and that's really moving forward, probably the best of any of these pillars, but it still has a long way to go, and that's attacking the largest single emission source. We the consensus is that much building heat should be electrified. Not all of it, for sure, but much of it. And then many industrial processes that now use fossil fuel should be convertible to electricity. And in all those cases, as we electrify, we gain very large efficiency advantages. Now, when we do all these things, we're going to need a power system large enough and fully clean to handle all of this. And one of the things that motivated the book was me asking myself, so how large a power system do we need when we do the energy efficiency that we're going to do, and we get clean energy from other sources? Electricity will not be the only clean energy source we rely on in 2050 or 2100. I think hydrogen will be important. Renewable natural gas may be important. Biofuels may be important. So I don't want to say that electricity alone is the solution, but electricity will be a overwhelmingly important part of the solution and a larger part of the solution than it is today. And so the question is, how much larger? Because that informs where we need to go as we decarbonize. So here's a quick back of the envelope calculation. If you take all of US energy use in 2018, and you convert all the transportation use, every bit of it, at 3 times its current efficiency, because electric cars are at least three times as efficient as their counterpart gasoline engines. And you convert industry with a 2x efficiency premium, which electrification usually gives you. And the same thing for all the residential and commercial use. Yeah, we'll post these slides later, but basically you double your current electricity use. So that kind of gives us just the back of the envelope upper bound on maybe by 2050 we need to double our grid. Well, I don't think so, but it's possible, and it's also doable. But that kind of gives you sort of an upper ballpark. Many of you know this is how I think about whether we're going to need 2x or 50% increase, which is 1.5x on this chart, or perhaps even we can keep electricity use at its current level with very strong efficiency policies along with electrification. I don't think so. I think when the efficiency policies that we've had, along with secular changes in technology that aren't policy driven, those are the two blue bars, and basically over the last decade they have offset each other and electricity use has been flat. But if you look out towards 2050, we need stronger efficiency policies that if they occurred alone would bring us well below current use. But I think when you add in electrification policies and possibly some AI and edge computing things that will push up use like Bitcoin, and also possible electricity use for direct air capture and direct decarbonization, I think the range is somewhere in the ballpark of 50% increase in grid by 2050. Could be double, could be less than that. That ballpark, I think, is enough that we can set sail for that in that general direction, knowing that we're going to need a larger grid. It isn't overwhelmingly or impossibly larger, but it probably isn't the same size as we have. I'm going to skip this slide. It's some deep decarbonization studies, but I'm conscious of the time and we've got a lot of ground to go. So, as I said, the first fuel, as Jim Rogers used to always say, is energy efficiency. And as I said, there is tremendous untapped potential in energy efficiency. We can be doing much stronger energy efficiency policies than we have, although some of you states, like Massachusetts, my home state for my institute, #1 in the ACEE rankings, do quite a lot of very, very good work. But if you look at RMI studies and ACEEE studies, you know that there's an enormous potential remaining to be tapped. That's number one. I'm sorry I don't have a slide on that, but I think we all understand that. The second source we want to look to is distributed energy sources, because they're local, they create local jobs development, which is really, really critical now in this COVID recession that we're in. It's always been important. It will never in our lifetimes be more important than now, I don't think. And so distributed energy generation is really, really important, even if on a kilowatt for kilowatt hour basis, it's more expensive than centralized generation, which remains true. But it's also just a technological fact that if we utilize all rooftop solar, and I think even building surfaces, in the near term, we won't get nearly the energy we need to get to the 20, 50, 60, 70% larger grid by using our rooftops. We should use everything from our rooftops. But as you can see here, and this is NREL data, probably some of you NREL folks are on, you've done fantastic work in this area with LiDAR, radar studies, which are what we're quoting here. My institute's home city of Boston can get 15% of its current use if it uses all of the available rooftops according to NREL's calculations. Miami can get 46%. This is current use, and we need to bump it up by a half. Germany, 35%. That's not from NREL, that's from another study. That's cited down there. Now, Phoenix can get almost all of its energy, and if it covered 18% of its parking structures and open parking lots, it could get 100%. But you'd still need a giant battery to store the solar energy overnight. So distributed energy is a critical part of the energy mix, but it doesn't obviate the need for increasing our bulk power system, our large wholesale grid. And that brings us to part two. So what do we do to increase this grid? Well, there's no surprises to all of you folks here. I will just read through this slide really quickly. The book goes into a pretty deep dive about what the benefits and costs are of large grids. And I think people are underappreciating some of the benefits of large grids, which is not to say I'm arguing for a coast-to-coast DC superhighway. I think that would be interesting, but I don't think it's realistic. We could talk about that in the Q of A. But big grids give you a lot of things: scale effects, load aggregation, natural geographic diversity of wind and solar. There's really important work done by this, including the work that is tragically being withheld that NREL has done. And my institute, heads up, has a really interesting paper coming out by some Brattle experts on the diversity benefits of wind and solar, and they're very substantial at distances of 750 miles. There's benefits of power trading, all of us understand. You guys in the West have just put up the EIM, and there's lower costs of preventing blackouts. So big grids give us a lot of things. They also face a lot of challenge. They're vulnerable to NIMBY resistance. They're vulnerable to the wildfires that are going on right now in California and other places, Australia. And of course, they must be built in an environmentally acceptable way. That's possible, but it takes a lot of work. Of course, the biggest issue in the large-scale grid, in the system as a whole, really, the biggest technological challenge is balancing energy. And that's, as many of you know, the white space between the wind energy and the hydro energy and the coal energy, or whatever you're using for your always-on baseload energy, including solar's not shown here because Northwestern Energy doesn't happen to have a significant amount. But balancing energy is the biggest technological need. No surprises to any of you that these are going to be the building blocks of a carbon-free grid. And I've roughly created the blocks in proportion to what I think is their sort of significance and importance. The big generation sources, I think, unquestionably are going to be wind, solar, Nuclear is big now. It's 20%, that's big. And if small modular nuclear reactors come on the way they might, it'll remain important. And I think gas power with CCS or renewable natural gas could be a very significant balancing resource, and there's a lot of progress being made on that. It will not back out any of the other three sources, it will complement them. The middle row is all sources that are important. I just don't see them scaling as much as the top ones. And the bottom row, which blocks are made the biggest, are most important because those are the big balancing resources. Large scale storage, basically hydroelectric storage now, which remains by far our biggest seasonal terawatt. In fact, it is our only terawatt scale balancing resources right now. Flexible load is potentially terawatt scale. There's research that's come out of both Energy Impact Partners, where I serve as Chief Strategy Officer, and the Brattle Group and other places showing flexible load capacity in the range of 200 gigawatts, a fifth of our system peak now. So that's very significant, but it's a lot of work to tap that. And then of course, the grid, which brings all of those benefits I mentioned on the earlier slide. And once again, all of the resources on the bottom, they are not substitutes for each other. They are complements. You want to leverage all of them in an environmentally beneficial manner and a cost-effective, least cost resource planning manner to get to a zero carbon grid. Not news to anybody. Here is my quick summary of what's needed to do on this big grid. Obviously, large scale storage. And here I'm talking about not 4-hour or 8-hour storage. I'm talking about multi-day storage and especially seasonal storage. So I mean large scale storage. Hydroelectricity works very well, but it's pretty much impossible to do at terawatt scale in the United States. Canada has some, and other parts of the world have some, and there are some significant environmental penalties involved. Hydrogen storage is coming quickly, and that's really encouraging to see. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but hydrogen is very important. It's clearly going to be a fuel of the future. It's going to contribute in places where electricity can't, I think. And also, it's going to complement electricity in very important ways because you can make electricity into hydrogen, and we will starting in 2022 in Florida, and vice versa. We can make electricity out of hydrogen, and both work very well. So it's going to become part and parcel of the whole electricity ecosystem. So for all of these things, we need continued our D&D. We need lots of demonstration projects. We need lots of R&D from international cooperation through the IEA and other groups like that, the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which I serve in, and other groups, all the way down to the state agencies and the utilities and the hundreds and hundreds of pilots that I know your agencies are running. I'm familiar with a small number of them, and they're critical. So thank you for doing them. This is an absolute critical area. Demand response potential, as I mentioned, there's a very large flexible load potential. This calls for market and regulatory reforms. Many of you are involved in these discussions. They go on every single day in regulatory commissions, every single day at the FERC and at the EU and other regulatory bodies, even China. So that's good. Transmission is underplanned and underbuilt in the United States. And this was particularly glaring in me because one of the things I did in the book is tried to look around the world at all the developed economies and do a comparison and draw from experience in all those developed economies. The emerging economies are different, and there are some significant differences there. But the United States really stands out in the weakness of its transmission analysis and planning. This is probably not news to some of you. One of the most controversial suggestions in the book And so many of you may not agree with this, but I propose that the federal government actually mandate um, what I would call enforceable regional energy planning, not just transmission planning, but regional least cost planning that would include transmission, but not only transmission. It actually would be energy planning. So it would also include hydrogen infrastructure. And it would be required, in my view, to put energy efficiency and distributed generation first, but then to plan for the balance and, of course, to plan for complete decarbonization no later than 2050 and ideally earlier. So that's probably the biggest single policy recommendation in the book. That's Appendix A of the book, is all the policy recommendations. And finally, I think the financial mechanisms for getting the big grid built aren't working as well as they could. And this basically takes us into the power market debate. This is a slide that I mentioned, could be our whole talk. So let me just sketch out the axes and give a very brief overview of what it is I'm trying to illustrate with this. As I looked at all of the debate over how to reform the bulk power markets, and particularly this is in the United States, but it is surprisingly similar in other countries and in the European Union. But there is, along the horizontal axis, there are those who really don't favor capacity markets as we now conceive of them, relatively short-term, usually centralized auction markets as we have in PJM and ISO New England. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's those who think that if we tweak capacity markets and disaggregate them into better products, they will be the overwhelming element of the solution. And there's also two schools of thought, somewhat orthogonal, as I try to illustrate, that talk about the importance of carbon pricing. And up at the top, there's the school of thought that says carbon pricing is essential. And the bottom said school of thought is that carbon pricing is extremely valuable, but we can get there. We can get to zero carbon before 2050, even if we don't have it. And so let's not put all of our political eggs in that basket. So if you make those the axes, you get these four quadrants. And indeed, you can see the literature cited in the book where people are arguing for one of these four approaches as the direction to go in. Just as an example, in the upper left, I call it the all of the above quadrant. Yes, price carbon, make better capacity markets, but don't rely too much on capacity markets. Allow long-term contracts and allow climate policies, direct climate policies to influence the market. Don't just rely on price signals. And then you can march around this slide at your leisure to see the other discussions. I don't say in the book that one of these is the perfect answer. I do personally lean towards the bottom left quadrant, personally, but I think what's important to do, and this is also going to be true in the distribution section, is to pick one of these and make it work in your region. And that goes to the need for regional energy conversations, regional energy planning, as well as the state action you guys are taking. Okay, that takes us to the retail sector, and we're on track to finish within 10 minutes, so that's great, and we can have a great discussion. Many of you know the United States is a unique country in so many ways. Some of them good, some of them not so good. One of the ways we're unique is we have an extraordinary number of distribution utilities, and not only of one type, but of course of three types: investor-owned, cooperatives, and public power, or so-called municipal utilities. There's about 3,000 of them, as many of you know. And thanks to Platts, um, you, I'm allowed to show you this beautiful mosaic of all of these distribution utilities. Now, in spite of their differences in location and geography and resource endowment and governance and regulatory status, there are some common pressures that all of these distribution utilities are experiencing. And I think the IOUs are experiencing them worst because they have pressure from their shareholder and the capital markets. But in brief summary, these are the pressures, and these have been around for a long time. These were the motivating factors behind me writing Smart Power way back in 2010. But many of you are familiar with them. Starting at the left and going clockwise, low to negative kilowatt hour deliveries. Overall, electricity sales have been flat in the United States for a decade, the only decade since the birth of the industry where sales have been flat. That's a credit to the energy efficiency policies that many of you have fought so hard for, as well as just the amazing role of information technologies and Moore's law in making much of our technology just progressively smarter and therefore more efficient. But also, the United States is a mature economy. We've poured most of our net cement growth and most of our net iron and steel growth. And so until we move into the era that we need to move into, where we consciously electrify end uses for climate reasons, we'll be in this low to negative short. That's why I put short run in the parenthesis. But this puts short-term pressures on everyone. And this is particularly bad now in the COVID period where sales have dropped along with economic activity. But that hopefully is a short-term phenomenon that will turn around substantially. To the right, increased CapEx to build a smart, resilient grid at both the wholesale level, where we do, I think, need more transmission and more transmission technologies, and certainly more large-scale grid-scale storage. But also in this section, in the distribution system, not only are we facing enormous demands from the fact that much of the distribution facilities that were built across the country are past their use-by dates, but in addition to just replacing them, because the grid is becoming multi-directional, far more complex, far more agile, and must become more resilient, there's much higher CapEx demands on building the grids, and also the need to plan those grids in a much more complicated, sophisticated way in order to avoid CapEx by using resources smartly. So this is a very demanding environment. Now, speaking of which, on the bottom left, how would I say this? The operating environment, as opposed to the CapEx at the top right. The operating environment for utilities is just unrecognizable from the time when old timers like me started in the industry, when the operating environment of a utility was keep the lights on, power's flowing one way into the breaker box of your customers, keep it going, keep it cheap, and if they have a problem, they'll call you on their touch-tone phone, and your call center will handle it. No, we now have a growth in severe weather events. They're trending up steadily. We all know that. If you have time in the Q&A, I'll show you an incredible map of the number of utilities that have been affected just in the last decade by severe weather events and have their service affected. So there's a much higher demand for resilience and bouncing back from these events, restoring service. As I mentioned, grids have become multi-directional. We need to accommodate distributed generation and demand response and flexible resources. And that is an operating challenge. You need to keep services reliable while you host larger and larger amounts of this. Your load factor swings by dramatic amounts that have never before been seen with electric vehicle charging and even more with electrification and heating. And finally, customer service expectations now, thanks to Amazon and many other web-enabled, app-enabled services, are much higher. Customers expect 24/7 services. They will not call a call center and be put on hold. They want to be able to log on and see what their service expectations, and utilities are adapted to this. But it takes work. Finally, and probably most uniquely to, I think, the discussion in Power After Carbon, I talk a lot about the risk of the distribution system fragmenting into microgrids and other defections, individualized defections, which I think are of much less concern to me, and I think much less concern to the industry. But I think as the microgrid technology gets better and better and the economics get better, we will see more and more microgrids. And that's all good so long as we create a integration and regulatory governance framework where we don't lose the benefits of a integrated distribution system, because the benefits of integrating all customers in a single distribution system are the small scale analog to all of the benefits of creating a big grid. There are much more economic benefits in sharing surplus power across broader distribution systems than there are limiting those sharing opportunities, those risk trade-offs, the economic trade-offs, and the reliability management within a microgrid as opposed to across multiple microgrids. And this is a first-tier governance and regulatory challenge that we are only now starting to cope with, as in Hawaii, where there is a microgrid tariff under development. And many of you, I know my colleagues in Massachusetts have done many good studies of microgrids and have many under planning. The city of Boston has a very interesting microgrid statute. But it's important to make sure that that doesn't fragment the grid. So if you're a distribution utility, you're facing really unique once in a century challenges, and you have to change your strategy and your business model to cope with them, or you should. And so this is taking up where Smart Power left off, but I think of them, whoops. Oh, this didn't come out right. Well, I think of there being three dimensions of distribution utility strategy. And when I PDF'd it, two of them disappeared. I'm sorry about that. You can see the graph in any of my other books and on the posted version of this thing. But one of the dimensions for any utility is the business model for its regulated business. And we're going to talk about that for the balance of this conversation. But there are two more dimensions that aren't shown on here that I'll just mention very briefly. One of them is you can diversify geographically. Your regulated utility can be located in Rhode Island or Massachusetts, where I am, but you can also diversify in other countries with other business units, and many holding companies are doing that. NL, for example, is in 55 countries, count them, 55 countries around the globe. So you have utilities everywhere from strictly local, and that's not just municipal utilities and cooperatives. There are many IOUs that have decided to stay local, all the way to multinational. And there's another dimension that all of you are familiar with, and that is expand your product line into deregulated services, which of course utilities have been doing since the 1990s. And that could be a renewable generation subsidiary, which in some utilities are the largest part of the business. But most utilities, the regulated business unit, and it's true even in NL, is by far the largest and most important source of revenues. But there's still increasing diversification, particularly now, into other synergistic but unregulated products. And that's something we could, again, spend a whole day talking about. But let's talk about the spectrum of regulated business models. And this is just a continuation of Smart Power. In Smart Power, I talked about the smart integrator and the energy service utility. which are the middle and right-hand business, new business models. I expand that a little bit in this conversation to go all the way from left to right. You could exit the distribution business entirely, and a few utilities have, and I think more are thinking about it because the distribution business is complex unto itself, and if they don't specialize in it, they shouldn't get into it. It's similar to the Eon Energy RWE separation in Europe, for those of you who are familiar with it. So I think we will see some exits from the distribution business, including perhaps some IOUs selling to co-ops or municipal utilities. But I don't think we'll see a lot of it, but see some of it. The next, going again from left to right, the next business model is really a passive distribution system owner. And here, operation of the system is turned over to an independent distribution system operator, DSO. Many of you know this has been discussed by many. Many attribute this to my friend John Wellinghoff and his colleagues who continue to argue for this. As John knows, I'm not a particularly big fan of this particular model, but we may see some of it. There continues to be discussion here and in Europe. But most of the action that I hear about, I see about, I think about, and I think is going to happen is in the part of the spectrum from the smart integrator to the energy service utility. And the smart integrator, very briefly, is the platform utility. It is the original vision from REV. You can see my which I was privileged to work on. You can see a shout out to New York there, as well as the EU's rules for all distribution utilities in the EU. Their vision is that they're platform utilities. They're not passive distribution owners, but their role is to enable multiple competitive providers of not just kilowatt hours, but also a variety of energy services to sell competitively through their platform down to customers. I'll skip hybrids for a minute, and on the right, energy service utilities are the other model, and that's the trusted advisor model where regulated utilities provide something closer to full service energy services, and they migrate their pricing away from selling on a per kilowatt hour basis to selling on the basis of services delivered. And whether that's heat, as some utilities are now selling chauffage in Canada, and there is movement to sell using a variety of new pricing approaches, which I think are very, very important. Then there's hybrid business models, which is really, I think of ComEd as a hybrid, but really very few utilities are pure smart integrators, I think, or will be pure smart integrators, energy service utilities. I think most will blend them. And that's where, as I said, I think most of the action is. And to regulate utilities in these three business models, you really need to migrate regulation towards performance-based regulation. It's really already happening. There's quite a lot of work in all of your states going on in performance-based regulation, but performance-based regulation is hard. It's not a bunch of accounting formulas. It's a constantly shifting, thought-intensive, work-intensive, stakeholder-intensive, research-intensive, analysis-intensive process. Sad to say, but true. But for all that pain, I think there is very, very important gain, and that's the reality of the complexities of creating a resilient, affordable, zero-carbon grid, modern grid. A quick shout out to some of the work that's going on in electrification. I think this is really important, and it's just the tip of the hat to these folks. And so I can summarize. Energy efficiency should be maximized, but this takes real work, and we need to push as hard as we can on it at the state level, at the regional level, and at the national level, where there is very important work that has been going on for years, but not nearly enough. a completely clean power industry, roughly 50% larger, maybe. I think it's necessary, and I think it's very achievable. If you look at the average annual growth rates required for a 50% larger industry, it's only between 2 and 3% growth a year, which is less than the industry has grown over almost all its history. Decarbonized big grids need storage, regional planning, and reform markets. We talked about that. The downstream sector needs performance-based regulation, new business models, and dynamic pricing and other new forms of pricing and rate setting. Talk of electrification of transport, heat, and industry needs action now. The reason I emphasize now is that it's going to take decades to electrify sectors to the point where we meet 2050 climate targets. This is the longest tail of any of what we've talked about. It's remarkable to me, but I think the supply side of the clean electric industry of the future can and probably will be ready before the demand side, and that's not a good thing. So we have to, if anything, collectively push harder on the demand side. And I said this is a 20-year project, hopefully a 20 and not a 30-year project, full speed ahead. And with that, I just want to note that if you want to buy the book, please buy it at bookshops.org. It routes the money to your nearest local bookstore. I have a lot of acknowledgments and thanks to my colleagues in many, many places, including many of your agencies. There's the acknowledgement runs 3 pages in the book, and there's a conflict of interest disclosure also there. So with that, 46 minutes, sorry I ran a little bit over, but we do have a quarter of an hour for Q&A, and I really look forward to it. Thank you for your attention, and sorry I droned on, and hopefully you guys are still awake.
Hey, thanks, Peter. No, that's a very useful big picture that puts a lot of specific aspects of what needs to change into a useful, broader context. Let me ask some of the questions that have come in. One goes back to your slide where you talked about the strategy of carbon pricing being only one possible way to go. And this person says that he thinks carbon pricing looks very important. How else can one externalize the costs of greenhouse gas pollution?
Great question.
The response to that.
Right. So basically, there are a number of different ways to substitute for a direct carbon price signal. The broadest one is cap and trade, where you simply create a shadow price by capping emissions, lowering the cap each year, and creating tradable emissions permits. That is, the morphism is the technical term for a price. But even without that, which is a perfectly good way to go, you can build a carbon price signal into dispatch decisions, even if you don't have a formal carbon decision, simply by requiring either in dispatch decisions or even in utility planning, as many commissions do, to treat the economics of your resource planning or the economics of your dispatch decision as if there is a carbon price. And similarly, when you set policies like cost benefit analyses for installing a hydrogen infrastructure or creating a rebate for electric vehicles, as many of you states have, or any of dozens and dozens of policies, if you create those policies with incorporating the very real and significant cost of carbon, then that policy is a substitute for a direct carbon price.
Okay.
Maybe not the best one, maybe not the most efficient one, but it is a substitute.
Yes. This goes back to your slide early on about the different shares of the total energy pie and the growing focus on transportation. And this person asked whether those estimates were pre-pandemic, and whether, now that you know what you know about what the pandemic has meant for telecommuting and people's work habits, will it still necessarily mean that we will have as great transportation needs in the future, or will the pattern possibly change?
Well, good question. And sadly, I think this is going to get worse, substantially worse. In fact, it is getting worse fast. If you look at the data, automobile travel is right now pretty much back to, and as of today, maybe above pre-pandemic levels. And automobile travel is overwhelmingly the source of these transportation emissions. It's something like 83% of all transportation vehicle miles, maybe more, are individual cars, not trucks. And that's back normal. And just yesterday, I think in the New York Times, a front page story, used cars are flying off the used car lots because people are eschewing mass transit in this era of COVID in the cities. And it's in the cities where the vast majority of our auto vehicle miles occur. And they're driving more and more and buying second and third cars because they won't go on mass transit, where ridership has plummeted by 70%, I think the last number, roughly overall nationwide, 40% in some cities, a huge decrease. And it's mass transit that is electrified in many cities and backs out emissions. So transportation, I think, if we looked in this year and next year, and I don't know how long the pandemic will be with us with its effects, it's going to bump transportation up in a very bad way. Electricity, most of the others, I think, are not going to be affected substantially, but they're not going to get any better from COVID or the recession. So that industry demand may go down a little bit, but not enough to really give us much relief.
Well, thank you. Sad, but thanks for the honest answer. And I have a couple technology questions that have come in. One person referred to research going on at NREL related to using bioreactors to produce renewable natural gas using hydrogen electrolyzed by excess clean power. Do you think something like that, renewable natural gas, has some potential for participating in a significant way in the future energy mix?
That's a great question, and really calls for more expertise than I have. But I have looked a bit in renewable natural gas and hydrogen. First of all, it is very clear that we will be using electricity to primarily low cost, you might say surplus, or very low cost renewable electricity in the future to electrolyze water and make hydrogen, which, as I said, is a very versatile and good fuel, but it is not the safest fuel to use in natural gas distribution systems in people's homes, at least not yet. I hope we can find ways to solve that. So I think the questioner is very sophisticated in recognizing that and saying, well, if we can make hydrogen cheaply, we can also make hydrogen into renewable natural gas if the hydrogen is made renewably. And then we can send that and use that without having to change any of the natural gas end use equipment or the delivery infrastructure. I have not seen anything on the economics, the long-term economics. Short-term, that's impossible because we can't even make hydrogen, just the first step of that, at current prices economically. So first making renewable hydrogen and then making renewable natural gas and then distributing it sounds like an expensive proposition. It is expensive now. I really don't have an opinion about whether we'll ever get to that at scale economically. There are definitely going to be niche applications for renewable natural gas. There already are some. I have a white paper on using natural gas for resilient microgrids on the Brattle website. And there are many different forms of renewable natural gas, but I don't know whether the whether the scenario the questioner posits is going to be long run scalable and economical. And I think that's the question.
Thank you. Well, in one of your early slides, when you talked about the future clean energy mix, you included nuclear power in there. One questioner was asking about, what is the realistic prospects for nuclear power given in terms of new generation, given the bad track record of nuclear power in recent years, meeting its cost projections, and then also given public concerns about nuclear proliferation and nuclear waste. How realistic is it that we really will start seeing additional new nuclear power plants being built?
Well, another question that's largely stumps me, and calls for greater expertise than I have. But here's what I know. Nuclear goes in I put it in 3 different categories. The first category is extending the life of current plants. That I think is very important. Many of you are doing that through your policies wisely. It has to be done safely, and that's an absolute imperative, and way beyond my expertise. But if it can be done safely, it's a very important way to back out carbon in the near term. But that's not anything incremental. That's preserving what we have, and that's not really what this slide that I'm showing on the screen is about. In terms of large nuclear plants of the scale of our current plants, I agree with the sense of the question. I think what I sense from the question, which is, I don't believe it is realistic in the United States to think that we will build any large new nuclear plants with the current set of technologies. I just don't, I think that's just economically not possible. So that's not why I put nuclear on this box. The third bucket, which is the reason why nuclear is on this box, and it is a question mark. I think I'll add a question mark to this slide. But it's the advanced modular reactors, which really are advancing. The first design just got its first set of approvals from the NRC. And I recognize this is a big if, but if everything goes according to plan, as I understand it, it will be operating by 2030. And I think these modular nuclear reactors, if they are economical, they may provide very, very useful building block, because they are unlike big nuclear reactors, these can follow load, they're adjustable. They should have very low operating costs. Their site requirements are a lot simpler. They're buried down in the ground. And if all of their advantages come true, they could be a significant building block. But I want to emphasize that there's a question mark around that. I'm encouraged by their progress. I think we should continue to look at that. I also should mention that further out, there's also some very innovative new kinds of nuclear plants that I really can't speak to, thorium reactors and so on. And there continues to be some interesting R&D on that. I'm skeptical of those doing much to help us by the 2040 target that it's important that we hit, but they're up. So all those reasons are why nuclear is on here. But as I say, the next time any of you see these slides, I think there will be a question mark on the nuclear. Thanks to you, questioner, wherever you are.
Hey, thanks. Hey, we just have 1 minute left. Is there anything you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say up till now?
Yes, thank you for all the work you're doing, you guys out there in the States, the laboratories of democracy. And I look forward to further dialogue. Feel free to email. All of you know where to find me. And please stay safe out there.
Hey, and thank you very much, Peter. This was really helpful today. Thanks for making the time. And I hope lots of folks go out and read your excellent book. So we'll be back with more webinars from the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative in future months.